Hello, everybody. Welcome to what I believe is one of the first in-depth public looks at the 2022 midterm elections. Future Majority is honored today to co-host this event with NDN with featured guests Simon Rosenberg, who I'll have a little more to say about in a second, and our dear friend Tom Bonier of Target Smart. My name is Mark Riddle. I'm president of Future Majority. We were founded in 2017, really focused on looking at data. We've done a lot of polling and trying to really figure out messages and things that work with the voters. So far to date, we've polled over 172,000 voters, primarily in battleground districts and swing states. So we have a pretty good sense what's going on out there with the electorate. Our North Star has been to also reclaim the word freedom from the Republicans and feel pretty good about that effort. But as a young whippersnapper a long time ago, I went to work for Simon, and he drilled into me kind of three things: data, and really pay attention to the details. And I was super excited to collaborate with him this cycle on this. We did a lot of work with Change Research, but more importantly with Fernando Mondi, looking at a lot of polling. We started seeing some interesting things in the electorate, and Simon was already ahead of the curve as usual in making these arguments. Tom came in and brought a lot of really interesting data, and particularly around the early vote. So just honored here today to co-host this event. Hopefully this will be the first of many, and particularly honored to have our dear friend Tara McGowan, who's been a leader, a patriot, a friend in the fight, really over the last 5 or 6 years that I've gotten to know her, and now heads up to very important work at Courier Newsroom to moderate this very important discussion. So thank you, everybody, for taking time today. Tara, turning it over to you.
Thank you, Mark. It's good. Well, I can't see everyone's faces, but hi, everyone. I'm very happy to be here and excited. I don't know how much moderating I'll need to do because I know how much Simon and Tom can talk and how enthralling this is going to be. But just a little by way of a tiny bit of background, Simon and I have not, well, I've known Mark for a number of years now, and Tom and I have been in similar circles. Simon and I did not actually know each other until just a few months ago. And the reason that we were connected is multiple people who had talked to both of us recently were saying that we were saying very similar things and put us together. And when we talked, I was like, oh, but you have evidence. Mine's pretty instinctual, to be honest, about where things are. And so it was a very, very fast friendship. And I've learned so much by being in community with this group, and very excited to kind of help facilitate this conversation. But I want to dive right in to the good stuff. And so, Simon, I want to just kick it to you to explain how, how and why the media got this wrong and what those early signs were, and just, take it from there. And then we can dig into questions. Last housekeeping note: if folks have questions in real time, please put them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will monitor them and try to get to them at the end, but don't worry about waiting until the end to write them so you don't forget them. So go ahead and do that throughout the presentation. Simon.
Sure. Tara, thank you, Tara. Thank you, Mark. And thanks, everybody, for coming. This is going to be Tom and I's sort of most extended discussion together. And so I'm really excited about it. We've done a few privately, but nothing publicly. And so this all began about a year ago. In late October, I had noticed that Joe Biden's approval rating had come down significantly. And the congressional generic, that basic question of are you going to vote Democrat or Republican for Congress, had not moved. And, historically, these things, move together. And there was already a sign that they were not moving together. And I tried to come to an understanding about that. And I actually was on Joe Trippy's podcast, and we had an extended conversation about this. And my theory was that there was a MAGA hangover, that there had been, a majority of the country had voted against MAGA twice. The Republicans then did a very strategically dangerous thing, which was to embrace a politics that had been rejected by the country twice. And it would be very easy to believe that you could be disappointed in Biden, but not have any interest in voting Republican. And that's part of what we were seeing. And what I wrote in that original memo in late October was that I think that 2022 was not going to be like 2010 or 2014 for three reasons. One is they were too MAGA and going to be too crazy, and reminding everybody who had voted against them twice why they shouldn't vote for them again. Second is that we will have done a good job and the country will be better off, I think also happened. And the third thing I wrote about was that we have more muscular field operations than we've had in the past because the amount of money our grassroots is giving us, because the intensity and passion of grassroots folks all across the country, and that we'd be able to mitigate midterm drop-off. And I think all those three things actually is what happened in the election, right? Is that they were too crazy, we did a good job, and we have really strong ground game that beat them on the ground in the battleground states. And so we were open to this idea that this was not going to be a typical midterm. We were open to the notion that this would be something different. And then in May, we know that the Dobbs leak happened on May 2nd. And then we went into the field with Future Majority to do Hispanic polling in Arizona, Nevada, and Pennsylvania. And what we found was Democratic overperformance and Republican underperformance. We were surprised, I'll be honest. I mean, I wrote the memo summarizing the findings of that work. And I was really surprised because we thought, we were doing badly in the election, red wave and Hispanics bad, right? And it turned out that, this data, we were a little worried that this data wasn't really accurate. These were high quality, large sample polls. But then I started looking around at 538 to see if this trend was, manifesting in other races. And it was. I mean, we were ahead in North Carolina. We were ahead in Ohio. We were ahead in other places. And I was really surprised because the data I was looking at was showing a close competitive election, which was the argument that Tom and I made throughout the entire general election, is that what we were seeing was not a wave election, but a close competitive election. And then the January 6th committee began. And then the Uvalde shooting happened, and another mass shooting happened in New York. And then, of course, Dobbs happened. And at that point, I think the election kind of congealed, and that the election that we saw in that polling with Future Majority was the election that ended up happening over the next 6 months, which was Democratic overperformance, Republican underperformance. And we saw it in the 5 House specials, where Democrats overperformed 2020 by 7 points, almost a miraculous showing in the House. I mean, if this was a red wave, we should be under 2020, and we were consistently over 2020 in kind of a miraculous finding. And then Kansas happened, and Kansas was extraordinary, right, in terms of the turnout. And that's when Tom started doing some really compelling analysis of Kansas, and that's when Tom and I kind of hooked up and started collaborating. And I want to turn it to Tom to take it from here.
Thank you, Simon. And just real quick at the outset, it's great to see so many people here in attendance. Thanks for taking the time out of the day. It's great to see so many familiar names in there as well. So as Simon said, for us at Target Smart and our team, looking at Kansas, as I think everybody opened some eyes in terms of, we knew there would be some effect from Dobbs. We knew it would have some impact on this election. And the question was, how do we quantify that? And really, how is that impact really manifest in terms of voter engagement, turnout, persuasion? And Kansas happened. No one predicted that margin, myself included, an 18-point pro-choice victory there. The first thing we did that night was look at the voter registration data to see, was the electorate reshaped prior to election day? And what we found was very much yes. Between June 24th, Dobbs, and mid-July, the voter registration deadline, I've shared this a million times and I will continue to share it, women accounted for 70% of the new registrants, which was an early and very forceful indicator of how Dobbs had taken everything that Simon has mentioned in terms of this MAGA hangover and really congealed and consolidated it to the point where we were seeing especially younger women engaging at a much higher level. Soon after that, we got the actual vote history data and found not only were women registering at a much higher rate, they were turning out at a much higher rate. Then we began to look at state by state by state across the country as we got voter file updates, and found that something similar was happening really around the country, that women were registering at a higher rate, but it wasn't even, which I think is consistent with what we saw in the election. I know Simon will talk more about this in a minute, that in some states we saw much more dramatic surges and much more dramatic gender gaps in the voter registration data. In some states, it was more minimal. but it was a fairly consistent pattern. So the next step was really voting, looking at the early vote data. So, and I have to give credit to our team at TargetSmart who do really incredible work. They launched a site. Hopefully all of you have seen it. If not, you can go see it at targetearly.com. And what it did is it took all of the early vote data. You know, as we know now, over 50 million votes in this election were cast before Election Day. And so it took these votes at the individual level and put them out on a publicly available website that helped to provide some context I think was missing in a lot of the public narrative around this inevitable red wave. I have to give Simon credit for this because every day he was out there taking this data, analyzing it, and promoting it, and talking about this steady trend of Democrats turning out at a higher rate in the early vote. When we look at the context of the previous general elections, 2020, 2018, seeing this enthusiasm. So what Simon and I were doing and talking about this every day, multiple times a day, was really testing the theory here. If the operating theory is an inevitable red wave that was generally based on polling data, and Simon will talk more about that. And then what were the other data indicators we had? It's everything Simon mentioned, from the overperformance, Democratic overperformance in special elections, the voter registration data that I mentioned, Kansas, and now the early vote data. Throw into that the fundraising data and the strong Democratic fundraising advantage. Really, Democrats were checking every possible box of intensity up to Election Day. And on the other side, you had the polling. So I'm going to throw it back to Simon to talk a little bit more about that last stretch there, the polling and sort of through Election Day.
So where we were, and I left out the fundraising numbers, which were really important. You know, on June 30th, we got the fund, you know, we had the reports in mid-July, right? So we had Dobbs happen on June 24th. Then Nebraska House Special happened where we overperformed by 10 points on June 28th. And then we had fundraising numbers, and Democrats, and the incumbent Democrats in the House had a 5-6-1 cash on hand advantage over their Republican counterparts. The Republican incumbents only had a 2-1 cash on hand advantage. And this is really important because, and we'll get to it in the discussion today, about how all this money that we're raising is giving us stronger campaigns, more robust and muscular campaigns that particularly manifested itself in the early vote, right? So this issue of these huge fundraising advantages we had was another sign of Democratic intensity, another sign of Republican underperformance. So what Tom and I were saying was, look, we had the House specials, we had Kansas, we had Democratic fundraising advantages, we had the registration advantages. Would this basic dynamic show up in the election itself? And then the early vote came, and the early vote was shocking, right? We were 10 points ahead of 2020 in Pennsylvania and Georgia, 20 points ahead in Michigan. Michigan won the award for the best early vote performance of any of the major states. But we were ahead of 2020 basically everywhere. And we were ahead of 2020 by about 4 points. This is, again, confirming Democratic intensity, Republican underperformance. And so what we were saying at the end in October was, you know, look, I mean, will this dynamic now show up on Election Day? We've now seen it show up in all these other places. Would it show up on Election Day? And it sort of made sense to us that it was. But the reason why we ended up with the red wave narrative, and this is important, is that there was a single New York Times poll that was in early part of October that showed Republicans up by 4 points. And everyone got jittery, right? Because we'd kind of moved everybody away from the red wave. I had attacked it during the summer. People came back to this close competitive election as much as people really wanted it to be a typical midterm. Most of the media was still suspicious. I mean, Politico wrote a piece about my analysis over the summer saying I was risking reputational damage, right, by my challenging the red wave. And yet we kept just showing data, right, in all this. And so what happened with the polling, and this is the really important story, right, of this whole thing, is that a single New York Times poll showed movement towards the Republicans. Everyone started screaming red wave, red wave. And then there was this effort to game the polling averages, you know, where it was in 7 different states, more than 40 polls, 10 different pollsters. all showing Republicans 3, 4, 5 points ahead, many cases 3 to 4 or 5 points more Republican than the polling averages. My best example of this was in Georgia. All the A-rated polls in the final few weeks had Democrats up 3.2%. All the Republican polls had the Republicans up 4.4%. So there was an 8-point variance between this red wave Republican polling and the high quality independent polling. We saw similar things happen in Washington state. And in every case, when the polling averages started to move, Real Clear Politics then declared these races either toss-up or lean Republican races. There's no question in my mind that Real Clear Politics was part of this effort to sort of show that the election was becoming a red wavy election. And so the media basically gave in to this, even though there was a lot of data that we were presenting to people that showed that the election was going to be a close competitive election. The red wave prevailed, and in the shouting, and it's part of what Tara and I will talk about in the Q&A, is that it's another sign of the power of the right-wing noise machine, to take a meme and turn it into a national story, regardless of its merits, right? I mean, just like the fentanyl and Halloween candy, which to me is one of the most extraordinary examples of this that we'll all ever see. But then what happened was I went on Joy Reid's show on October 31st and challenged the media, everyone who does analysis, to back away from the red wave and to view the Real Clear Politics and 538 now as corrupted instruments that had been corrupted by this dirty campaign, this illicit campaign, and that it was really, if you stripped out this red wave polling and just looked at the independent polling, what you were seeing was a close competitive election, consistent, frankly, with the data that Tom and I were presenting. And remember, in that final week, Chris Cillizza said the bottom is falling out of the Democratic Party. And we were seeing the early vote get more Democratic and younger every day, right? Things were actually getting better for us in the final week, not red wavy. And so, we got attacked by Nate Silver. There, folks from Cook Report sort of mocked Tom and I and the work we were doing. There were many people who didn't just disagree with us, but they actually mocked us. Nate Silver famously just said I was smoking hopium, right? In the final week, but we stuck to our guns and we stuck with the data. And on the day before Election Day, I wrote a memo saying that based on the independent polling, it looked like that the Senate was going to be good for us in Arizona, Georgia, and Pennsylvania, that Nevada was a toss-up, and then Ohio, Wisconsin, and North Carolina were going to go Republican, which is exactly what happened, by the way. But the point is that the data was there. And the bamboozlement of the political class and the consultants by a combination of this dirty polling and just the bluster of the right wing and, all the other stuff, contributed to this narrative at the end. It was going to be a red wave. And so Tom and I in the final, the day before Election Day and on Election Day itself, put out these memos and these threads saying, look, if the election's a lot better for Democrats than people think, here's why, right? Here's an explanation. And thank God we were right? I mean, the important thing here is that once again, the intrepid American people, rose up to prevent MAGA from seizing power in the country, the third consecutive election that Republicans underperformed with MAGA as their, governing approach. And, we ended up having what was really an historic midterm, right? I mean, not only did we do better in the battlegrounds, then we gained in the battlegrounds. Let me go through this. In the battlegrounds, we actually gained ground in Arizona, Colorado, Georgia, Minnesota, Michigan, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, right? But which is incredible. But we flipped state legislative chambers. And I just want to say to everybody who participated in this, who were part of our community, this was an extraordinary election. I mean, the more that we look at the data, the more that we understand the dynamics and the physics of this, a typical midterm, Biden's low approval rating, inflation very high, Russians and Saudi raising gas prices, right? All these things, the fact that we gain ground in the battlegrounds is just an incredible collective achievement by all of us. And I just want to say I'm so proud to have been in this fight with all of you. I mean, my Twitter feed got 100 million views between the beginning of October and mid-November. We were out there fighting with all of you. And I kept saying, we got to all leave it out on the playing field, right? And I hope that that that's what we all did. All of us on this who are here, the four of us and our collective organizations and our extended family, we left it all on the playing field. And I know that all of you did too. And so thank you so much. And that's our quick story. And we want to now turn it to Tara to guide us through a conversation, and we'll get to questions just in a few minutes. But thanks everybody for being here today.
Thank you, Simon and Tom. So I have been reading these questions in real time. Thank you guys. Keep them coming. There are a ton. I doubt we will get to all of them. We will try our best. But I want to start to pick up on where you just kind of ended, Simon, about where we saw the most ground being gained in the battleground states. And we have a few questions in the chat about New York, about California, about where the red wave surface. I'd love you to spend a little bit more time on that, on why you think that is and what also that's going to mean moving forward. But we'll talk more about 24 later.
Yeah, look, it's the big story of the election. The big story of this election is that we gain ground in the most important presidential states, not all of them, but in most of them, in an election we were supposed to get killed, right? And so part of the argument, if you read the analysis that I put on my website, is that there were really, in my view, there were two elections. This was not a nationalized election. There was one election, a bluer election that happened inside the battleground, and a redder election that happened outside the battleground. Inside the battleground, where we had these heavily funded muscular campaigns, we were able to control the information environment and build unprecedented, grassroots organizations that were able to take advantage of the early vote. Democrats leaned into the early vote in ways that we had never done before strategically as a party. The early vote was always kind of the Republican thing, not our thing. We were election day party, right? We've learned that doing GOTV over 14 days is better than doing it over one day. And I don't think we're ever going to go back to the way that we used to do this. This was I don't think people really understand how significant this kind of strategic innovation was. The DNC deserves a lot of credit. They spent $90 million helping bolster the grassroots organizations in the battleground states. And so we had unprecedented ground games that, of course, were fueled by the work of people like everyone on the call today, right? I mean, the strength, with more money, we have bigger field operations, but those field operations only work if we've got volunteers going door to door and doing all the hard work and doing the texting and doing the calls and writing the postcards and all the stuff that all of you, did this cycle. So number one is that where we showed enormous strength, and where the Republicans, and the reason why you're seeing the Republicans squawk so much about what happened in this election, is that we demonstrated that we are in control of our own destiny in the battlegrounds, and that we are stronger today in almost all the battlegrounds than we were, not all of them, but most of them, than we were in 2020. And it's why, I still argue that I'd rather be us than them as we head into 2024. But Tara, the downside of that is that where we didn't have these robust campaigns and where we didn't control the information environment, we fell off. We fell off in the 4 largest states, which is one of the reasons why the national vote was so Republican. And that's a reminder that this right-wing noise machine and their capacity to control the day-to-day information war is still far more advanced than ours is. And it's what keeps me up at night, right? It's the thing that worries me the most. I'm excited by our ability to defy historical trends and make gains with these robust campaigns and the money that all the folks on the call on this discussion today gave us. But we also have to be worried that in the day-to-day information war, we're not where we want to be, and we've got work to do. Tom, I know you've got lots of things to add in there too, so I toss it to you.
Yeah, and I'll be quick because I know we have so many questions here, which I do appreciate. We talk a lot about those states, the underperforming states or districts. Another thing that I would throw in, I agree with everything Simon said, is, the broad theme here was a rebuke of Republican extremism. And in terms of how people internalize that and experience that, and the extent to which they saw Dobbs as a real and immediate threat, which in so many states it was. Either choice was literally on the ballot, as it was in places like Michigan or Kentucky, Montana, or it was effectively on the ballot based on the statewide candidates, the state legislative races. In places like New York, California, the threat wasn't as immediate. It speaks to what Simon has talked a lot about in terms of this Republican echo chamber and what people believe to be true, and a great opportunity for us as Democrats and progressives going forward to be able to expand our footprint and to expand that battleground. I think we did an incredible job. The other quick point I'll make, because I see a lot of questions sort of to this effect in the Q&A, is our frame of reference matters, right? People were talking about, would this be 2010 or 2014 in terms of what type of Republican wave election it would be. But now after the election, and I'm glad we are aspiring to always do better, we're comparing to 2018, which was probably the best midterm turnout for Democrats just about ever. And we're saying, well, in these places, we didn't reach 2018 levels, and that's a failure. Or this group didn't reach 2018 levels, and that's a failure. Absent this rebuke of Republican extremism and the incredible work that many people on this call did, remembering that, what I'm talking about here is mostly an observation of that work. Without that, the results everywhere would have been significantly worse, including the places where we didn't perform as well. It would have been even worse without that rebuke of Republican extremism. So I think we have to think of that frame of reference when we're internalizing and analyzing these results.
Great, thanks, Tom. So I've been thinking about how to articulate this question for a while, because what I want to get at before we pivot to talking about kind of like what this means moving forward, which I think is a big meaty topic for us to dive into, and there's a lot of questions around, is actually about how we prevent this binary of a narrative, right? So you guys have talked a lot about how, where and how the polling got it wrong, et cetera. Something else that I felt when I started to kind of beat this drum before Simon and I even met was that the media has specific incentives related to their audiences and audience engagement around elections. There is an incentive there beyond just the right pushing it for them to talk about a red wave, et cetera. We could get into that, but also it felt like so much of the inertia around and just the pessimism that existed across the board about Democratic's chances was rooted predominantly in conventional wisdom and historical data that preceded Trump winning in 2016. And my theory, I know it's shared amongst a lot of people, but that is the electorate fundamentally changed. And at least for as long as MAGA is a prevalent force in our country, I do believe that change will persist. And that's a positive thing for Democrats if we do invest wherever and whenever we can. But when we think about that, and there's specific questions related to is presidential approval even relevant anymore, right? As a factor, what are the right data sets and conditions that people should look at? How should that thinking shift? Because what we relied on for so long no longer feels relevant, and in fact leads us astray in a lot of ways. So whoever wants to take that.
Tom, why don't you start with that one?
Yeah, I would love to. I mean, I think the answer is that we have more data, but it's also more complex. And in the end, there was this media reaction, but not just the media, to be fair, to bad early vote analysis, because there was a lot of that out there in prior elections, where they would say, well, you can't learn anything from early vote. And as I've said many times, but if you can look at 50 million people voting, and we know everything we know, that's individual level vote history. So we know their age, their gender, race, ethnicity, past vote history, partisanship. If you can look at that and say, these are people who voted in this election, and you can't draw some sort of conclusion from that. We're not talking about predicting outcomes. We're talking about creating a framework within which we operate and context for these results. Then you're not a very good data analyst. And we saw a lot of that. And so, Tara, I think it just means we've been over calibrating on the polling, and we've been under calibrating on all the other elements that are actually complementary to the polling in so many ways. Polling tells us how people are going to vote. It doesn't tell us if they're going to vote. Early vote tells us that they voted. Voter registration data is a good sign of intensity, enthusiasm, as are special elections. So the reality is we need to be looking at all of these things. And yes, fundamentals. Everyone likes to talk about the fundamentals in terms of context, economic numbers. They matter, but we over calibrated to that really in the sense of our priors. Just real quick, I do want to, we talked about the media. There are those in the media who did a much better job with a lot of this and did pay attention to this. After Dobbs, 90% an estimate of the reporters who I talked to were women reporters who felt that this would have an impact and want to understand it more. And I think that's important to throw out there. Also, reporters, their job is to report what's happening and why to a certain extent. And when they're hearing from the polls that what's happening is a red wave, and then they're even hearing, and I see a comment to this effect in the Q&A, which is a very good comment, from Democratic consultants backing up this notion that a red wave is inevitable. I think we have to throw that into the mix too, that we can't put this all on the shoulders of the media.
Yeah, and I'll just say two things on this. One is that you know, the way data works is that it all has to point in the same direction for it to be meaningful. And then oftentimes data doesn't all point in the same direction, and therefore you're kind of in an in-between place. You know, it could happen, you're not really sure. And what was important in what we did was that it was all pointing in the same direction, right? All of the analysis we did, and, you know, we started with our poll in May, right? And we, you know, I explained the job approval rating and why it was not as powerful as it was before. And then we saw the Nebraska special, and then we saw New York and Alaska. You know, these specials happened, by the way, in Alaska, New York, Nebraska, Minnesota, all different parts of the country showing very similar trend lines, right? And so part of what we kept saying was, I know everyone was traumatized by the data miss in 2020, but we should be as concerned about the data miss in this election as we were about the data miss in the last election. And the data miss in this election was an undercounting of Democratic performance, an underestimation of Democratic performance. And I think people were so spooked by what happened in 2020 that they ignored stuff that was in front of them, right? That was telling them that this election was just going to be different, and that everyone kind of gave the Republicans 3 to 4 points that they didn't actually have, right? In many ways, in many of our own polling. And there's going to have to be a really significant discussion about the struggle of our polling in the last now several elections, which were different struggles, right? They weren't the same. It wasn't just a miss. Because remember, the red wave wasn't a miss. It was the opposite of what happened, right? And this is really, it's not a miss. That's a big swing. The second thing I want to say, and this is really important, Tara, the way you've phrased the question, was let's talk about inflation. I started writing back in December, around the same time that I began my challenging of the red wave, was that that inflation was being exaggerated. The role of inflation was being exaggerated, and it was being exaggerated for two reasons. One is that economically, wages were almost keeping pace, and for a while were actually ahead of inflation. So people actually weren't falling behind. People who drove a lot and had and inefficient cars were being really hurt by inflation. And those are mostly Republican voters, right? So inflation was much more intense on the Republican side. Regular everyday people were not being crushed by inflation based on economic analysis. But then the second part of the inflation conversation was that 2/3 of voters didn't blame Joe Biden for inflation, which was, by the way, fair, right? Given that inflation happened because of COVID and supply chain problems and the Russia war. And so the other red wave story of this election was the inflation, the way that Republicans basically blustered the media and a lot of our friends, right, into believing that inflation was actually more devastating to workers than it really was. And I waged an earlier campaign to get people to back off this inflation stuff, which, by the way, utterly failed. I mean, I was much more successful in the red wave. But part of the reasons that I was open to the idea the red wave wasn't coming was that I felt they were exaggerating the role of inflation, particularly, by the way, with Democratic voters. I mean, what's interesting is that one of the things I think we all have to sort of come to a common agreement about is the most important issue, polling question, has become worthless because the Democrat and Republican information environments are so radically different from one another that all that matters is breaking down the Democrat and Republican information environments. There isn't a collective understanding of politics anymore. There's not a common place that we all reference. There's these two separate places, and understanding the differences between the two is actually far more important than creating this false impression that there is like freaking out about inflation. Republicans were always 20 to 25 points more concerned about inflation than Democrats were. Did that ever appear in any story ever, despite huge amounts of data? No. And so again, I go back to this basic idea that the breakdown in this election cycle was not in data, it was in the analysis of the data. And it was across economic, there was a huge economic problems in the way people were understanding the economy and how it was playing out. I think voters knew at the end of the day, right? My favorite exit poll number is that 52% of voters said the economy was either better or the same as it was 2 years ago. And we won those voters 74 to 24. And that's because Joe Biden's been a good president, because the country is better off. And even though 25% of the country gave him a 0 rating, the rest of the country actually thought, if you look at Democrats, his approval rating among Democrats was incredibly high, right? And so we got bullied by a very noisy right wing this cycle into believing all sorts of things about what was happening in our country that weren't happening. And we've got to learn from that and be better, as we go forward.
Absolutely. And I want to add on to your point about the right-wing efforts to really push the inflation story and the media picking it up very quickly. Because I think, and you've said this before, Simon, but I don't want it to get lost in the shuffle. They had a very, very specific objective to change the conversation away from abortion. Even though that is not where a lot of people that became motivated after the Dobbs decision were. And so it was very strategic. And I think there have been a lot of comments in the questions too around Democratic doomsdayism and pessimism, and what Tom said about the contribution where it wasn't just the media. It was a lot of Democratic pundits and consultants, and frankly, a lot of my colleagues and friends that I was getting into tiffs with, and I know you both were online and offline about this, who were just relying on, wanting to not be wrong and basing and, feeling in a safer community of the people that are expected a red wave or expected Democrats with an incumbent president to fail because they've lived through that before. But I think that connection is just deeply important about a right-wing agenda and incentive, and then the media taking that, and then Democrats going against themselves based on the conventional wisdom. It's a perfect storm that we just experienced. And I think it's a good segue to talk about what does all this mean moving forward. One point, Simon, that you made that I just want to underline it so many times over is that when we invest and when we drive the conversation, whether that is through competitive paid media, owned media like Courier and other properties that are coming online, et cetera, we can really make ground, and we can win, and we can build progress. The election is over. The spending is gone. There's very few pieces of infrastructure like ours. And yet the conversation is still going to be driven by the right? And it's certainly going to be economic focused. If they're deciding, it's certainly not going to touch on abortion or threats to equal rights and liberties or what have you, all of these things that we want to protect for Americans. So what does need to happen now? If you had a magic wand, either of you to chime in about how we ensure that we don't cede ground today after what we learned from where we went and how.
I'm going to give 3 quick points, and I want Tom to weigh in here as well. So one is that we have to become louder. And we were very loud this cycle in the Battlegrounds where we had a lot of money, but we need to become structurally louder in every way. It doesn't mean we have to be nutty and crazy, but we have to become much more intentional about just being louder. They're very loud. We're not as loud as they are, and they are beating us in the loudness war. It's one of the reasons, Tara, I'm excited you're with us today, because I think you're developing one of the organizations that's making us louder. But we need far more institutional capacity to match them. We're not going to catch up with them in the next 2 years, but we got to close the gap. The second thing is we've got to use the implementation of the 3 big economic bills that Biden passed: the CHIPS bill, infrastructure, and the climate bill, to re-engage in an economic conversation where we have the goal by the summer of 2024 being ahead of the Republicans on the economy. One of the things we didn't really talk about is that, we did well in this election despite being down between 5 and 15 points on the economy. I mean, that's sort of an extraordinary achievement by the family. Imagine if we go into the 2024 election ahead on the economy. That has to become a priority of ours. And as those of you who know my work know, that I use this simple stat, which is since 1989, there have been 46 million jobs created in America. 44 million of those have been created under Democratic presidents. Basically all of them. We should not be losing the economic argument to the Republicans. The third, though, and this is really something I'm going to be talking a lot more about in the coming months, is about sentiment, negative and positive sentiment. I think we have to recognize that part of their goal, the greater MAGA goal, the goal of Russia and China and Iran and others who are meddling in our daily discourse, is they want us to feel bad about ourselves. They want us to feel bad about America, about democracy, about our leaders, about our institutions, about each other, about the American project. And we can't let them do that anymore, right? We have to recognize that when we get down, we're enabling bad forces to prevail. We're using bad forces arguments about us against each other, and that we have to become intentional about winning the economic argument, about putting more positive sentiment into the world as an antidote to the negative sentiment machine that is MAGA. And I think this is something we really, really have to talk about as a family, because we were bad this cycle about this. And a lot of what I try to do through my Twitter feed and my public commentary was put positive sentiment out into the world, in a world where there was very little positive sentiment. And I think this is the other really big takeaway that I have about the things that we need to do going forward.
I'll just add, I agree with all that, of course. And I will just say quickly, Republican extremism isn't going anywhere, as we've seen, which is unfortunate, but also in terms of our ability to continue to beat this back, it's important. And Dobbs is, a lot of people think that it was it's gone now. People voted on it. Dobbs will continue to have a significant impact on elections at every level of the ballot going forward in perpetuity until something dramatic changes. I also want to add as a quick aside, because there's something like 70 questions, which I appreciate so much. We are obviously not going to be able to get to all those in the next 15 minutes. I've done the math. It's not possible. Simon and I love engaging with folks. People ask us questions all the time on Twitter, things like that. So please feel free to reach out. We're obviously going to get to as many as we can in the next 15 minutes, but definitely feel free to reach out to us directly as well.
Thanks, Tom. And just on your point about Dobbs, because this question I saw, hi, Lucas asked it too in the chat, is I really, really believe, in the vein of putting to dead, bad, broken conventional wisdom, abortion is not an issue for Democrats to run on or embrace or be unequivocal about protecting. Has to be one of the dominant lessons out of these midterms, because if we do take our foot off that pedal, we know that the rights are in the state's hands right now, and we still have a lot of work to do there. It has to be a voting issue through 24. If we make it all about the economy, as the right will want us to, for better and for worse, I think that we could lose some of that turnout juice. I think it's just so important. So I want to take a few more of the questions from here. I really think a lot of them are in the vein of like what this means. I know, Simon, you talked about this in terms of just the volume and things of that nature.
Yeah.
But what about also like all of the great efforts that did work, and the energy that's been created? How do we keep harnessing that? What do we need to do more of in battleground states that it didn't happen because there wasn't as much national investment? And I'm talking about North Carolina, I'm talking about Florida, talking about a few other states. It's really hard to swallow, knowing that if more money for the Senate race, et cetera, had come into those states, maybe it could have made a difference like it had in others, because they weren't top priorities for a lot of groups. What are some of the other sort of steers about how we can kind of harness the energy that exists? Take that hopium, take that positive sentiment, and keep carrying it forward with some actionable things that folks on this call can actually do.
Yeah, I may rename my organization the New Hopium Network.
Love it.
And
your new podcast, Hopium.
Me and Nate, baby. So couple things, and this is a little bit unformed, but I want to just reiterate one really important thing before we all go, which is that heading into 2024, I'd much rather be us than them. I think that our brand will be stronger, because I think we will be successful in Ukraine, and the economy will be stronger today than it was, and people will understand both of those. So whether Joe Biden's the nominee, and I think he's going to run, but in case he doesn't, I think that whoever the nominee is, that we're going to be in stronger shape. There's still going to be all sorts of MAGA, as we've seen in the last few weeks. I mean, it's not just, the January 6th committee report and is going to be a bombshell. It's going to continue to remind voters the next year and a half about how anti-democratic and illiberal they are, as well as I think the political pain for them on the abortion extremism and the Supreme Court is only just beginning. I think, of course, I agree with you, Tara, 1,000,000%, that, that our ability to continue to define them as being unfit and extreme and particularly around the abortion issue, is going to be very important. And so I think if this election was a stay the course election where we did good enough and they were still too crazy, imagine in 2024, if it seemed like we did not just good enough, but we did good and they're still too crazy. I think we've got a real opportunity to not only win the presidency, but to regain the House. And I think the Senate will be very competitive. I think one of the big questions, right, that I don't know the answer to is, how do we turn our politics on every day? and not view our politics as something that happens around elections. I think their politics operates every day. I think they're 24/7, 365. They're winning the information war every day. We still have this kind of thing where there's elections and then there's non-election time. And I don't think that that's right anymore. I think we have to, and I think that a lot of the energy, what I was blown away by during this cycle was that I think that, I spoke to a lot of grassroots groups all around the country, and I was so blown away by the energy and passion and patriotism that I was feeling in these meetings. It was one of the reasons why I thought we were going to do better than expectations, because I could feel it on the ground. I think everyone understands the stakes of 2024. I don't think people are going to rest. I think that one of the things all of you should do is that, start putting your money aside. You should give money early next year. The question is, can the National Party and some of these campaigns start giving you things to do now, right? So that you're not doing stuff just starting in the summer of 2024. One of those things is that I think, getting back to what we talked about earlier, is that I have this view as a war room veteran that we should view the war room not as 20 kids in a headquarters, battling it out with the mainstream media, but it should be 4 million people getting up every day, wired into the DNC or the campaign as information warriors trying to win the information battle every day. And I think that is something we can do in the first quarter of next year. I don't think that's something that we have to wait. That's a permanent, always on thing. Their party is much more amplified and networked than ours is. They've asked their people to become information warriors. We haven't done that with all of you. I'm asking all of you to sign up for this now, because it is one of the pieces, that a chess piece that we have to move. We made our field organizations far more robust and muscular than they were. We need to make our information operations far more robust and muscular than they were, in the way that you're doing with Courier, right, Tara? And I think that's part of my thoughts as we look forward.
I just want to add one tiny addendum to that and then hand it to you, Tom, is just for people that do fund different organizations, fund them now, but also ask them what could they do if they had resources to do work right now and not save it next cycle, because that's where we really need to be driving program year round and no longer think in the cycle. So just underlining that point, Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, amen to that. Thank you. To your question of waving a wand, I think one thing that it's important for us to do collectively is to be clear-eyed about sort of what happened in this election and how. And 2 quick points I want to make on that. One, you look at the performance of this president and this White House, who have been politically questioned going back to the Iowa caucuses and proven right every step of the way. We think about the reaction to the democracy speech, to the student debt forgiveness, and then we see the actual impact. We see that in the exit polls, actually people rank democracy very high. We see that younger people were surging in voter registration after that action. It's going to take time to get this entirely right. The second point here, the voter files, it'll take 4 or 5 months before our team has collected everything and we know exactly who's voted. There are a lot of hot takes out there, especially this week, that are talking about Democratic turnout was actually really bad. Young people didn't come out. Voters of color didn't come out. It's just not true. And we don't have the full picture. But to the extent that there is some data in those conversations, it's comparing turnout to the best Democratic turnout. Again, I alluded to this earlier, in 2018 for a midterm election. There is no question that the Democratic coalition was broad. It was persuasion and it was mobilization, which is what it always is when we succeed. And the fact of the matter is, so is likely when you look at the traditional Democratic progressive constituencies, the best performance in turnout for a party in power in a midterm election ever. And so, again, it's going to take time to get the exact numbers. I do think we need to be clear-eyed. And then, yes, we do have to be real about where we can do better, which, as we all know, will always be plenty of opportunities. But as a party, I think generally that's not our problem. We do the negative thing pretty well. We don't always do the positive thing well enough.
And Tara, let me just add one thing to this, and this is something I want to work on with Future Majority, particularly in the next few months, is that if I said loudness, win the economic argument, more positive sentiment, there's a fourth, which is that we have to make young people the center of our politics and not at the periphery. We have to I think the party needs to make a huge commitment to dramatically increasing the turnout and registration of young people. We won 18 to 29-year-olds by 29 points. We won under 45-year-olds by 13 points, which has been about where it's been in the last, on average over the last 10 to 15 years. That's where our margins come from. And our greatest margins come from the people that vote the least. Well, guess what? We have the power to change that, right? I mean, we just have to, we know what to do, right? And frankly, we've done a really good job at providing young people, executing on their agenda, climate change, gun safety, right? Getting people back to work. We've drawn the line on abortion and freedoms and rights and all the things. And so I do think if we want to get out of this stasis where every election feels like we're on this knife's edge and that if somehow we stumble, that democracy will be imperiled. If we want to get to a place where we really end MAGA's, venal grip over the Republican Party, to me, the only big systemic thing that could change this basic dynamic is by dramatically increasing the participation rates of young people. And it's something that we just haven't invested in. It's been at the periphery of our politics. It needs to become central. And that's an always on, immediate, voter reg, January 2023 kind of thing across the whole country, is something that somebody's got to take the leadership on and get that done.
That's right. And when we take audiences for granted, or we don't think they're going to show up based on historical data that's no longer relevant, we don't invest in it, and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And Gen Z is only halfway at voting age. They have lived through this. They've lived through mass shootings. They've lived through climate change impacts. They've lived through having abortion rights taken away now. They are incredibly activated, and we have to nurture that. And so I couldn't agree more with that. We have just 5 minutes left. I want to just kind of let you guys give, if there's something more you want to say or something that didn't get said. You guys have read the questions too. There's a lot of tactical things. Again, as Tom mentioned, reach out directly to folks because we can't get to all of these, but kind of what is your greatest source of hope to stay in vein of that? And then anything else you might want to say we didn't get to. Simon, you're first.
The Democratic Party is really strong right now. We had our third really good election. I've been doing this a long time, and I'm really proud of our party. We didn't give up. We were gritty. We got dirty. We fought it out in an unbelievably adverse environment, and we were able to not just hold our own, but actually gain ground in the most important parts of the country. I'm so energized by that. It was, in some ways, this was among our most remarkable performances as a party in the modern era. And, we beat back Trumpism by 8.5 points in 2018. We won the House, the Senate, and the presidency in 2020. We now did this. What's next? Right? Well, we got to win the whole thing, and we got to win it by a big margin. And I think that the only way that we end, the grip of MAGA on the Republican Party is by beating them badly in 2024. And I think we can. And I just want to say for everyone in this room, if you think that Ron DeSantis is some kind of moderate alternative to Trump, and that there's some path for them in the next 2 years to create distance between them and MAGA, look at what's happened with Elon Musk and Marjorie Taylor Greene in the last few days. They've been more crazy MAGA in the last few days than they've been in the last few years. It's who they are. It's what they are now. Yesterday, DeSantis went into deep anti-vax crazy mode, right? And so, they're not going to be able to present a party that has distance from MAGA in 2024, which means that MAGA is on the ballot again. And it means that this anti-MAGA movement that has fought so hard, heroically, ferociously, in such a patriotic way, and done all the work and the postcards and the fundraising and everything else, we got to go do it all over again. And the thing is, this time, what I think we have to recognize, as I said, is that we need to start soon. Everyone's got to rest and take time off and see their families and do whatever you're going to do during the break. But, we got work. We got to go back to work in January because the stakes remain so high for us and our job isn't done. And I think the opportunity for us to do really deep, lasting damage to MAGA is now within our grasp. And because of that, I want to just say that I want us all to start with this place that we're strong, we're positive, we're successful, we've done a good job, not from the place that we spent most of the last election cycle, which was a different place. We don't have the luxury of that kind of pessimism about ourselves and our collective enterprise. Enough of that. That has to be part of the past. Now we're part of a strong, muscular, successful party that's going to go kick ass in the next 2 years. And if that's the one thing I can ask of everybody, it's to change our attitude about how we approach all this. And I think if we do, I think we can have an amazing cycle.
Tom, last words?
Yeah, I mean, you asked where we get hope from. That from Simon just gave me hope. And frankly, I do want to say again, because I see so many familiar names who came to join us here, and it's affirming to see so many people at this point. This is when we're kind of trying to rest and recoup, even though, as I mentioned right after the Georgia runoff that night, I tweeted out, "Welcome to the 2024 cycle," which was met with some groans, which I understand. But I do want to say it's been affirming, if I can say, to this group, to have so many people lift up the work that Simon has done and that we at Target Smart were putting out there. But I also want to make it clear, we are not the heroes in this story. The heroes are those, and again, I see many of them in the call here, who are out there on the ground doing this work that made it happen. I'm proud of the work that our team at Target Smart did in helping provide data and polling and analytics to these efforts. I know Simon is incredibly proud of his team, and a lot of us on this call worked here together on these efforts. So I'm proud of that work. I'm grateful that y'all came to hear us today, and let's go get them in the new year.
Thanks, Tom. I want to echo that. I want to thank everybody for letting us hang out with you guys, for being great, such a great audience with great questions. Mark, thank you for bringing us all together. Do you want to close us out?
I think Simon said it best. Let's get a little rest and go kick their ass again.
Great. And I do believe this will be available for folks. I'll let Simon and Mark follow up with folks on that. We got that question a gazillion times, so people can access it or share it with their friends. But thank you all again. Have a wonderful rest of your week, and keep the hope alive.
Thanks, everybody.